morning and welcome. My name is Stephen Johnson. I serve on the select board, and I've been helping with this project in a variety of ways the entire 4 years that I've been in town. So thank you for coming out this morning. Your input and reflections on what the town needs and how we move forward are really helpful. The goals for today, however, are not everything all at once. We're looking at how a variety of uses might fit on a property that the town has invested in. And in doing that, it's largely jigsaw puzzles, but it's more than that, as our friends from Dodson Flinker, Pioneer Valley Planning Council will explain. It's going to be grounded in facts, so we will try and refer to references that you can find on our town website or on the PVPC website. There's a ton of information down there. And so with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter Flinker of Dodson Flinker.
I think I'll hold this. I can do that without getting too tangled up. Yeah, welcome. It's great to be here. We've been doing a lot of work over the last, 6 months, working with the committee and meeting with various folks, trying to figure out, not what the answer is, but what is the range of possibilities for this site. So it's really testing out, based on what we think the capacity of the site is and the different factors involved, which I'll talk about. What could you build on the site, and how would you arrange the different pieces to create something that's more than the sum of its parts, right? Something that really is a real town center. We heard a lot in the earlier workshops that people really want a place to gather, a place where different groups can come together. And that doesn't, in theory at least, that doesn't require spending more money than you have to spend anyway to build all those different elements. But if you arrange them correctly, you'd again build something that you didn't have before, which is a sense of community, a sense of a wonderful place to gather, something which is a great place to hang out because it's beautiful, it's filled with wonderful things and wonderful people. So that's what our ultimate goal is, and we'll sort of take you through the thought process. So we're going to start with the presentation. I think the first three on that side. Yeah, great. We're going to start with the presentation, which hopefully won't go more than 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to have an open house where you can talk to different committees. We're going to be seated at the tables about their plans for different aspects of the site, like the Senior Center Building Committee, the Open Space Greenway Group, and then we'll also have the plans that we've been working on in the back of the room that you can ask questions. And then we'll come back together and have a little bit of discussion. So plunging right in, at our first workshop in, what was that, March? We had different stations set up, and a lot of you were probably here. One of the things we talked about is what's something called a SWOT analysis, which is strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Really a good way to get a big picture take on what's going on with a particular site. Some of the strengths that we heard about: proximity to existing homes and businesses, the school, the future rail trail. Again, the synergy between the different uses like the senior center, the public safety, and possible housing. And the support by bringing those things together for walking and biking. So you don't have to drive everywhere within this place, hopefully. Some of the weaknesses we've heard: amount of traffic already on Route 10, potential stormwater runoff, impacts on neighboring lands. What's the demand for retail and office space in this area? How do we pay for it? Who's going to pay for the high cost of construction of any new buildings and development? And then how do you deal with septic regulations, and how do you deal with the sewage that is going to be generated by uses on the site? Some of the opportunities, as I said already, creating a new town center that weaves together existing uses beautifully and holistically, potential for adding commercial parcels to the tax base, creating enough demand, that is enough stuff close within walking distance of Route 10 at the site to justify public transportation, slowing down traffic on Route 10. I already heard this morning that traffic goes too fast on Route 10. It's very noisy and dangerous. So perhaps having a real center there can slow people down. And then organizing parking in a way that's safe and really provides a place, again, where you can sort of circulate internally within a site, not to have everybody pulling back and forth into a number of different parking lots on Route 10. Some of the threats people are concerned about, the loss of open space and just the fact of having more growth in town, what this might look like and how it might impact the look and feel of the town, what happens with water supply, the underlying aquifer, again, stormwater issues, children in the school system we've heard about a lot, how many people will live here, how many kids will they have, and then we heard, I think universally from Lynn Drive residents loud and clear, please don't put traffic onto Lynn Drive. So we also did what's called a visual preference survey, where we put up a lot of different development types to get a sense of what people thought was a good fit for the town of Southampton. Smaller buildings like duplexes and townhomes were preferred over larger buildings like apartments. And then within that, people favored the type of building design that really looks like it fits in Southampton. Traditional New England farmhouse styles, porches facing the street, parking hidden in the back. And then, can't quite see it, but example number 3 is townhouses that are sort of gathered around the village green. And I think every time we talked about that, we heard strong support, creating that kind of a visual center and a center of activity. In terms of mixed use, pretty good support of the kind of buildings that might have shops or restaurants on the ground floor and apartments above them. Many people thought that this could support a walkable commercial center and also support the kind of businesses that people say they want, restaurants and small shops and cafes and so on. And again, people like the look of traditional New England buildings. There was mixed feelings about apartments. I think as you see from all the red dots at the top, we heard loud and clear that people aren't really comfortable with the kind of 3- and 4-story suburban shoebox apartments that are getting built in a lot of towns around the valley. But there was a fair amount of support for, in the center, those are what's sometimes called a stacked flat, or basically it looks like a traditional house, but instead of one family having 3 floors, there's a separate apartment on the 2nd and or 3rd floor with multiple people sharing that building. But it looks like a big single-family house. And then there was a fair amount of support for what's sometimes called a manor-style apartment, which is built to look like a single extended farmhouse or a country manor or estate. But again, on the inside, it's cut up into multiple different apartments. We had a table talking about users and needs, obviously. We heard that older adults could use the senior center, some housing, walking paths, community gardens, and public transit. We heard that single people and young families could use, obviously, more affordable housing and proximity to existing businesses, the school, and the bike path. Several groups said that multi-generational spaces were needed that might combine housing for young and older people, some kind of community hub or community center, and then outdoor recreation spaces that could be shared by the community. And again, trying to create a sense of a real town center, which to some extent is the design in terms of it looks like it's a town center. To some extent, it's accommodating the activities that you want to see there, people gathering, a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, a place to have festivals and so on. Several groups mentioned strongly the need to minimize costs and or balance costs with revenue from the site. The need to manage traffic and construction, stormwater, and views of the site from adjacent properties, particularly Lynn Drive. And then we also heard a lot of support for the public safety complex. Obviously, you're still working out how much you can afford to spend on a public safety complex, but I think universally people support the need for that new facility. A lot of groups desired additional businesses, particularly a reasonably priced sit-down restaurant, good quality food, and local serving businesses like a cafe, a bookstore, or even a brewery. Several groups said various age groups need more outdoor recreation, ball fields, basketball courts, pickleball courts, etc. Several groups also were opposed to pickleball courts, presumably because of that noise that they sometimes make. Ken Comey is going to talk a little bit about the results of the community survey. Ken, remind everybody your position at PVPC.
Good morning, everyone. Ken Comey, I'm the Deputy Director of Land Use and Environment at the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. You've likely seen Kyle, Fennell, and Aiden, Hemi, and McMahon, and they were the PVPC staff working on this. But I'm pinch hitting for Kyle because he just had twins. So I'm here today with a short presentation on something that I believe you've seen, but this is a summary of the community survey results that you took way early in the process. Approximately 177 individual participants in the survey, which represented 140 households based on the IP addresses that were reflected from those participants. And you'll see that as I go through these slides, a lot of them reflect what Peter summarized from the forum. Most of the participation and key themes supported pedestrian circulation on the site, local restaurants and small businesses. There were mixed reactions to the civic uses. Many comments suggested youth and intergenerational community spaces. That's exactly what Peter said. This was a question of the survey. Which of the following uses would you like to see at the Zero College Highway site? And the top three were public safety complex, access to the future rail trail, and the senior center. Regarding the senior center and public amenities, two questions were asked. Regarding the senior center building, how would you prioritize the following features? And regarding the public amenities, which of the following would you prioritize, including the project site design? The feedback on the senior center included a support, concerns, and ideas for integration of various municipal functions, the intergenerational hub, a place to meet. Other suggestions included rail trail access and passive recreation, youth-oriented space and tea programming, environmental design, which a lot of communities are talking about, of how to be more conscious of some of the impacts of climate change, looking at solar, cooling centers, and privacy buffers. With regards to the commercial uses and economic considerations, there's high support for restaurants, cafes, and professional offices, including healthcare offices. A stress for small, local, and non-chain businesses, no big box stores. And I think as Peter also explained and summarized from the forum, that was definitely clear based on some of the ideas that you had for mixed use and the support that you might have had for those types of structures. Highly encourage more than half restaurants. That also, the sit-down restaurant was the thing that was picked out by Peter in the previous slide. Convenience stores and banks, discourage, and so those were your highest. But in bold, and I didn't even see that, it was meant to be stressed, interest in development that generates tax revenue and supports community needs. So as Peter mentioned, to ensure that there would be tax revenue for the town with any sort of new commercial development. With regards to housing, there were two questions asked. How would you prioritize for any new housing developed on the project site, and the types of housing would you encourage on the property? Survey responses showed low support for housing development on site, but regarding new housing, housing for older adults, and affordable housing, those were the top two that were prioritized. And then the types, mixed use and townhouse, which I think reflect some of the designs that Peter had shown and that you had worked on at the last forum. However, even though that there may be low support for housing development on the actual site based on some of the survey responses, there are housing needs in Southampton that are real and documented, both the master plan and housing production plan, which were worked on in the past couple of years, identify this particular area as a suitable place to meet those needs thoughtfully. And then I'm going to pass it back to Peter.
All right, so that's some of the public input. Now we're going to turn to what's the capacity of the site to support development. If you just look at sort of physical development factors. Wetlands, in New England, they drive a lot of development decisions. Here, happily, they don't. There's only a small corner of wetland down in the, I guess that's the southeast corner of the site by the former railroad tracks. Otherwise, it's pretty well drained. And the reason is, if you look at the geological origins, some of you may be familiar with that. This is the site there, sort of the center where we're at right now. If you look at the geological map, that yellow represents glacial stratified deposits. And that means that when the glaciers were leaving the area, they basically left a deep deposit of sand and gravel in that location. And that's basically why this area of town got built up, I assume. It's because it's well drained, it's easy to do a septic system, and above that well drained sand and gravel, that's a nice layer of farmland soil, which is borne out by the soil map. And they're basically, these different colors represent different slopes, but it's primarily a hinkly loamy sand, which is a very good farmland soil. And then there's a finger of Merrimack fine sandy loam that comes down on the north part of the site. That's actually considered prime farmland, which is soil that is drained enough so it doesn't get too wet, but wet enough that it doesn't get too dry. It doesn't have many rocks in it. Very easy to do farming on there, but also very easy to do construction. Again, which is one of the reasons this area probably got built up in the 50s and 60s to the extent that it did. Slopes are probably the biggest constraint. The green is relatively mild slopes, which you come down, that's College Highway, the curve at the top. Pretty much the front of the site, as you know, is flat, big flat open field. And then you drop off down toward the rail trail and the Manhead River. You get those steep slopes in the band around the base of the site. But it basically makes that southern part of the site not very easy to develop anything. Then there's a question of wastewater. There has been a study of the sewer line to Easthampton. There is a big number on making that happen. We're assuming for the purpose of this project that probably we're not going to have a sewer connection in the foreseeable future. So we're mostly looking at what could you do without a sewer line. And that's what the next slides are about. Big factor limiting development of the site is the fact that it's in a so-called Zone 2 Aquifer Protection District. And that means that it's considered a nitrogen-sensitive area. And because there's nitrogen in our wastewater, they put a limit on the wastewater discharge to 440 gallons of wastewater per 40,000 square feet of lot area. So basically you can have one 4-bedroom house, which represents a generation of 440 gallons, basically 110 gallons per bedroom on 1 acre. So if you took the whole 45 acre site, there's a maximum of 21,562 gallons a day that you could work up toward and not exceed. So at 110 gallons a day, that's a theoretical maximum of 196 bedrooms or 98 2-bedroom homes, which is a lot in a town like Southampton, but it's not hundreds of homes. So that's sort of the upper limit of what possibly could be built on the site with wastewater. The other wrinkle is that under Title V, if you generate more than 10,000 gallons a day, you have to build a much more advanced wastewater treatment plant, which is why if you look across the state, there's hundreds of developments that are 40 to 45 units in a project, not higher. That's because they can build that 40 to 45 units and stay below the 10,000 gallons a day limit on a single system. If you go beyond that, as in this wastewater treatment facility in Westford, you have to build a much more expensive, many millions of dollars to put something like that in. So most projects are either 40, 45 units, or you jump up to a couple of hundred units. So again, if you're worried, as a lot of people are, about the extent of development on the site, there's an absolute limit based on the amount of wastewater that you can load onto those 45 acres. There's also a limit as to what's practical to build with a shared septic system. So that's basically what the sort of upper limit of development is driven by. Now this is looking at the site, and what we're going to do now, we've been looking with north toward the top of the page, but I think most people don't really think of the site that way. They think of it looking from College Highway and looking south toward the mountains. And so we're flipping it around. See, the north arrow is now pointing south. And so all the plans we're going to be talking about now have College Highway at the bottom. This is Lynn Drive. And then the site, here's that big flat area. And then you see those contour lines. That's where the hill slopes down and drops about 90 feet down to the old railroad line in the Van Ness River. So there's steep slopes, 40 to 50% in some areas. There's a series of sort of natural drainage corridors that, again, the soil drains pretty quickly, but probably in a morning like this, you would see some water flowing briefly through the woods down one of those corridors. One of the things we looked at is historic photos, and in the 1950s, there was more extensive farmland, basically carried that whole front half of the site was strawberry fields and other farm activities happening. And then also that southern part of the site, where it's flat down by the railroad, was also more strawberry fields. And some of that's grown up into forest, some of it's still open. And then there used to be a farmstead in the front there, which is still, like if you walk in from the street, there's some giant oak trees, and you can see where the farm used to be. And then one of the things that's interesting is that they figured out a long time ago the best way to get access from the front of the site down that 90-foot decline to the back. And what it is a long road, which is still present on the site, a farm lane that wraps around the slope of the hill and goes all the way around. And so when we looked at a potential connection from the front of the site of Route 10 to the rail trail, basically that's the only way you could really make it happen. But the good news is, if you built like a 10-foot wide multi-use trail going all the way down there, the whole thing could be done at less than 1 foot rise and 20 feet of distance, which is 5% slope, which means that it's accessible for people in wheelchairs and also safe for people on a bicycle who don't get up going so fast. So basically using the old route of the farm lane to get that access. So there's a couple givens on the site. One was looking at a potential fit for the public safety complex. And so we took the current plan for public safety complex, which is 20,000 square feet. This is sort of an idealized plan for the public safety complex, which has direct access onto College Highway on the top, and then parking surrounding it for different uses within the building. We also looked at the current plan for the senior center. And this again was something that was done a couple of years ago by Abacus Architects. Basically a very nice 12,300 square foot building with a variety of uses, meeting spaces, gathering spaces, and offices. And one of the things they had in their report, which we're very interested to see, is an idea for outdoor spaces that could be surrounding the senior center, including potential for public or shared pathways, community gardens, and then outdoor gathering spaces. So, looking at the site, there's basically a big open flat area that extends to probably 100 yards, 200 yards from College Highway and then it drops off, goes down the hill. So what we did is a number of preliminary options, and here's several of them, which basically look at developing a new mixed-use village on that most buildable part of the site. And what we learned is there's really only one way you can effectively access the site. That's a roadway that comes in kind of at the center of the frontage on Route 10, and then creates a loop so that you don't have just a single cul-de-sac. It's kind of several different ways to get to the interior of the site. Public safety really wants to be on College Highway, so there's direct access. Really only several areas you can do that, either one side of the road or the other. In terms of mixed use, again, that wants to be visible. You have commercial uses that needs to be visible from College Highway. Probably the easiest to split off those sites as separate building areas. But there is a possibility to put something more in the center of a new village if it was just serving a sort of local area. Senior center, again, we heard previous discussions that doesn't need to be on College Highway. In fact, it might be better in a more quiet part of the site. But we're also looking at what could that benefit from in terms of adjacency. So if it's next to the public safety complex, for example, it could easily share a septic system. It could easily share parking. It could share other things that would make both of those easier to build and save some money. And then possibility for residential. Again, if you have those other uses sort of being more toward the front of the site, then there's room for a fair amount of residential development on the loop in the back. And then mixed in a series of parks, give people a wonderful town green. Some of these could also serve to be the distribution field for the septic system or stormwater management, that kind of thing. And then secondary access. I don't think that you need for public safety to have direct access onto Lynn Drive. But I think it's always going to make sense to have an emergency access just in case something happens that you have to have that access. Also, it's going to make sense in terms of connecting utilities like water and electrical lines through the project and just making it more efficient. So what that allows us to sort of plan for the worst, but not have to have a permanent connection. And I don't think that anyone really would, even if it was open, which we're not suggesting, for traffic as a full road, there's really no reason people would go that way, because probably there's going to be a better connection directly out to Route 10. And then the multi-use trail, again, connecting down that sort of winding road that goes around the site at 5%. We also looked at a second series of options that was really focused on the site less as a village center and more as a focus on open space. So this could be future ball fields or other open space uses, or it could be continued use in agriculture. So again, something that would fit into the traditions of Southampton, but also have a fair amount of room for the development that you need. So again, the loop road that comes in, public safety up toward the frontage, mixed use either on the frontage or close to the entrance, senior center, sort of adjacent to those uses as appropriate, and then residential uses around the back. And then there's a lot of room if you push the development more toward the back, toward where the hill starts to drop off, but not over the hill. There's a lot of room that you would save then for potential parks and farmland. And then again, the possibility for some internal connections and an emergency access over to Lynn Drive. And then the road downhill to the bike path. So that introduces the different scenarios that we're looking at, what you're going to be able to look at in detail in the back of the room. We brought some models and so on. I just want to sort of go through the ideas of both of those. And again, there's many different ways to approach the site, but what we're trying to do is figure out the general big ideas, try to clarify which direction we want to go. And so that's sort of a combination. How do we access the site? How do we do circulation and parking? What parts of it do we keep open? What parts of it do we look at future development? And sort of how do we optimize all that And then beyond that, there's a question of what does the public safety complex look like? What does the senior center look like? How much housing? What kind of housing? So all those are decisions that are going to be made kind of separately. So it's a little bit of a three-dimensional puzzle. But we're hoping that we can start to create a kind of master plan framework that any number of different uses could hang on. And again, which would optimize what we're trying to create, which is a wonderful new center for Southampton, regardless of what uses actually end up there. So this is the existing conditions on the site. This is sort of the first general option, which is a mixed-use village, again, sort of in that the big open field area. And then the second one is keeping the field open and pushing the development back a little bit. And so this is kind of the two major themes we're looking at this morning. So looking a bit closer, in terms of like that, a wonderful pointer. So we have basically an entrance road that comes in the middle of the site, sort of in between those two clusters. There's two pairs of giant oak trees, which potentially could be saved, and then a new road coming in between them to a wonderful village green surrounded by a mix of uses, which I'll talk about, and then protecting the whole back of the site as open space with a trailhead, some parking for the bike path, and then the bike path connection coming down that hill at 5% and connecting with the future greenway. And then in the woods, there's lots of possibilities for walking paths and trails that would connect through from the different development areas and create a wonderful, hopefully a wonderful experience. A lot of possibilities for trailheads. This could be something that brings people safely to a place that they can park. There's information and access to the greenway. Also potential adjacency to businesses that are on the site. So another reason someone could have a cafe or an ice cream shop, serve people who are coming to the greenway. So looking at a little bit closer, some of the different uses. Public safety building on the frontage with its own dedicated driveway, so you can pull right out of the bays onto Route 10, and then the trucks would circle around the back when they return back into those bays. There could be some visitor parking in front of the building, and then parking behind the building that would be shared with the new senior center. So again, you see how these two uses can sort of support each other by sharing this parking. So when there's a fire call, there's lots of parking for people to come for that, but the rest of the time, those spaces would be available for people coming to the senior center or the uses. And then also by consolidating that parking, you use less space overall, which opens up more open space. Some of which could be the septic distribution fields under some open space, could be community gardens, and then across the street a wonderful village green that would then be shared by some number of townhouses, in this case 45 townhouses divided up into sets of two dwellings, 3 dwellings, 4 dwellings, 5 dwellings, to really give some variety to the way that looks. And then on the opposite side of the entrance road, a mixed-use area. These would be potentially buildings with shops and offices on the ground floor, and then apartments above them. So there's a potential, the way this is laid out, for 25, 28 units on the second floor of buildings, which would provide, some workforce housing, so-called workforce housing within those buildings, an alternative to the larger townhouse structures. So what we heard, as I said earlier, is a real preference for townhouses, as shown at the top, that really look like more traditional farmhouse structures. So this is up at Village Hill, across the line in Northampton. These are some other projects, but again, it's sort of a townhouse, but it looks more like traditional homes that would just happen to be connected together. And elements like traditional detailing and porches make them look better and also make them work better. And then for mixed use, again, shops on the ground floor, offices or apartments on the upper floors. But we know a lot more now about how to design these things so they fit into a place like Southampton than we did 20 and 30 years ago. So there's a lot of great examples of how to do that. And then you bring these things together within walking distance, then they support each other again. You can walk from your house down to the coffee shop or get an ice cream cone. And then again, shared public parking really makes more efficient use of space. This is a new project in Upton that combines a library and senior center, a town playground, and the VFW, all of which shares a new parking lot. And one of the benefits of bringing the parking together, more efficient circulation, because you don't have to pull out onto the main road as much. And also you can use some of that space for greenery, for introducing stormwater back into the ground and rain gardens and so on. This is shared parking that's partly owned by several banks and partly owned by the town in the center of Amherst. And this is in Hadley behind the new library there, where they have shared parking for a number of different uses. So it really makes sense if you're doing sort of, in these cases, revitalizing an existing village. In Southampton's case, you're really sort of reinforcing and creating a new village center. So again, looking across this first plan approach, it's really a series of sort of development uses that are designed to enclose shared space. So this is a beautiful town green lined with trees. All of these red lines indicate pedestrian paths. So part of this is coming up with a series of kind of design standards for whatever this development ends up being. So whatever it is, we want to have a focus on shared space surrounded by trees. Whatever it is, we want every part of it to be connected with safe, accessible paths and sidewalks so you can walk. It's easier and more enjoyable to walk from one place to another rather than drive. We want to have shared parking, again, for all the benefits that provide. We want to connect uses that are shared by the community, like the senior center, with uses that are private, but also complement that, like this private mixed-use building that might have a wonderful outdoor cafe facing the open space, these wonderful townhouse buildings. But again, one of the secrets is you pull that path away from the front of those buildings so there's some private space in the front for people to have a little dooryard garden. So again, something that we used to do 200 years ago in every village in New England, right? It's like you had a hedge and a fence that separated your house, your front door from the street or from public space. And we kind of forgot how to do that, which is why most of us go to a modern townhouse or a condominium development and say, boy, I don't want to live there. There's no privacy. But it's pretty easy, if you think about it, to create that kind of transition from the public spaces to the private space. And then it also makes that a more usable, wonderful place to live, right? Because you have a little garden and a tree instead of just walking out onto a sun-baked backyard. So again, we don't know when and if the housing is going to get built. It's going to be up to a number of future discussions to determine if housing is appropriate on the site and who's going to pay for it. But again, the idea is to come up with a master plan idea that if housing is built, this is how it can reinforce and make this whole village center better rather than worse. So part of that is intentionally designing small parks and open spaces with places to sit, things to do, having outdoor spaces that are customized for senior center and other uses, having a garden that you could stand up or sit to work on, places to have shade and play shuffleboard if that's your thing, or pickleball, places for outdoor dining, which might be thinking about outdoor dining at all levels, your private home, the senior center, the private businesses, and then really connecting those all together. So this again is the second sort of major option, again a focus on open space, preserving that farmland, pushing the development more toward well, I guess it's kind of a curving around the center of the site, but more toward the top of that hill where it breaks and goes down to the rail trail, keeping the open space at the bottom, having that multi-use trail connector, and then really consolidating the farmland so that it can continue to be used for that purpose. So a similar mix of uses, in this case, the public safety building on the left side of the road as you come in. And this would mean that you would pull, because this is kind of a difficult place to have an access because you're going down the hill on a curve, you would probably have the main road where we showed it in the other plan, so the public safety would come out onto that main road and then they would have to take a small right turn. And if you're familiar with the new public safety headquarters, probably 20 years old in Northampton on King Street, it does exactly this. It's on the corner. You have to pull out of the garages and then they pull out onto King Street in that case. And there's a light which they can control and turn red when they need it. So we understand there's relatively few actual fire calls in Southampton. And a lot of the calls are for ambulance purposes. I'm seeing there's a lot of ambulance calls. So again, we don't know enough to make this decision for you, but I think it is a possibility that probably would work pretty well if this ends up being the best location for the public safety complex. So you basically have a light here that you can turn red and then they can pull right out. And anybody that was stopped here from the rest of the development then would have the ability to get out of the way. So again, protecting this farmland, putting the senior center, again, that road comes in through the edge of the existing field, the senior center in the woods at the back with a dedicated parking lot, maybe a farm-related retail mixed-use space in the center there, and then a secondary access again, for this case, for 40 townhouses lined up. Then I showed the possibility of a senior apartment here on the village green. This would be a separate building, like a 2-story building, which could have 25 or 30 senior apartments in it. Again, a wonderful place to live, also within walking distance of the senior center, within walking distance of a farm store or some other use there, and obviously good access to the public safety building. So again, I think one of the things we also forgot how to do in recent years was to really intentionally design the open space within a project. So you often have a cul-de-sac and then there's just this big circle of green with no real purpose. And so the idea is to give purpose to every open space in the project, and what that does is it adds to the value of the whole thing. So make a wonderful town common in the center, to have community garden spaces that are both useful and beautiful, and perhaps in this case help to buffer the active farmland from the other uses. Or to do something like this, which is some of you may be familiar with the work of Grow Food Northampton, that helped to purchase 175 acres of farmland and forest, and now has 400 community gardeners, I think a 12 or 13 acre part of that, and then they sponsor, I think, a half a dozen different small farmers, and it's basically a small farm incubator. So there's an herb farm that started there that got up enough business that now they've purchased a farm elsewhere. They've got a community-supported agriculture farm on part of it. All kinds of interesting things happening. And the problem is, if you're, as you know, if you're trying to get into farmland, it's really hard. And so there is that possibility with this site, since it's already owned by the town, is you could preserve that farmland and use it for something that would benefit young farmers, that would benefit people who want to have a community garden, and so on. So again, this could be that sort of more formal town common space with parking that could be shared with the apartments and the mixed use here. This could be, a farm operation for one of those small farmers with apartments on the upper floors. And then this is the senior center with the parking, but then this part could be community gardens or other uses related to the senior center. So lots of possibilities. And again, we're not used to seeing, especially in the town of Southampton, we're not used to seeing uses pushed together quite this much. But one of the ideas I want to leave with you is that by bringing those together, you make it much more walkable, right? If you design it properly, you have these beautiful sidewalks lined with trees, and it's easy to get from one place to another. You have privacy because you very carefully carved out individual spaces for everyone to have a yard, little spaces outside the apartment, spaces outside the senior center, but they're all connected by this path system, which separates the public space from the private space. And then the benefit of bringing this all together is you save all the rest of it, rather than like the current zoning, which is, what, 30,000 square foot lots, which would just be more, everybody then has individual open space on their property, but there's nothing collective to be shared. So that's kind of the idea. It's a traditional New England village. And I think that is the end of Ken is going to tell us, that's the end of my presentation. Ken is going to tell us some more about the concerns that we heard about potential impacts.
So, from what I understand, based on your previous forum, and I think as I do this work also in the Valley, these are definitely considerations for any sort of new development or any sort of thought process by adding a new development to a community. So really, I think you have to understand, based on some of the presentation by Peter, is with no final development plan, we may have thought of, or the various proposals may have contemplated a final number of housing units or certain types of commercial type uses. But I just wanted to present some general thoughts with regards to what types of uses have these various impacts. And this one is particular to traffic. Trip estimates depend on the final land uses. So obviously, all of these particular projects will need to get permitted by the planning board or another land use board. And those particular special permits and site plan reviews do require traffic studies. And would require a lot of contemplations, probably with engineers and your planning board, to understand what types of impacts you will have to College Highway and this possible new road, but in addition to how that may affect the rest of the town. So for instance, I just put the single-family homes here as an idea, although it's not necessarily presented in this particular presentation, about 9.5 trips a day per unit. And that this is coming from the ITE, the International Traffic Engineers, and this is used as a manual for the traffic study folks when they present these types of project impacts to the town. Low-rise apartments, about 7.3 trips a day per unit. Retail, about 43 trips per day per 1,000 square feet. Office space, 11 trips per day per 1,000 square feet. As I mentioned earlier, a traffic impact study is required during site plan or special permit review to assess trip generation based on the final land uses that may be contemplated and decided upon. Also including the different types of safety measures and required improvements that include turn lanes and signage. As one of the examples that Peter presented, where the public safety compass may be contemplated with access from the road that comes from College Highway. Obviously, there would be a lot of discussion with regards to signalization there. That's obviously an option for traffic calming. But other possible mitigation tools include rectangular rapid flashing beacons, always stop control, dedicated turn lanes, street lights or other lighting features, and then because it's College Highway, it's the Mass Department of Transportation needs to approve whatever final version of the street geometry. With regards to the school district, So this is a conversation that may be happening elsewhere in the valley with regards to new development and the conversations regarding how it may impact your schools. This slide on the right comes from MEPC. There was a study done earlier this year, February, with regards to how new apartments, and this is coming from the conversations that are related to the housing discussions that are happening all over the state with initiatives that towns are taking to rezone their properties to allow for new housing. So MAPC did a study of all the communities in the Commonwealth and noted here for Southampton that between 2019 and 2024, enrollment in Southampton declined by 6%. So that's just a note. My review of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Department website with regards to 2024-2025 say that there's about 675 PK through 6th grade students in the district, and then obviously Southampton being the largest district, our largest community in the Hampshire Regional School District, they probably are sending off the more students to the high school and middle school. So with that said, but they don't necessarily, or at least the data that's presented on the website doesn't draw out each of the communities in the Hampshire Regional District, so I couldn't come up with that final number. So that's just some context for how many students there are in the town. On the left side, some of the conversation was how the housing types and the different housing types that are contemplated and how they may lead to additional students in the district. So as I mentioned earlier, I use single family detached as an example. About 0.6 to 0.8 students per home in a single family detached. For a duplex 2-family, 2 to 3 bedroom units. About 0.4 to 0.6 students per unit. Apartments, obviously you can see anywhere from 0.05 to 0.6, depending on the amount of bedrooms. And then senior housing, age-restricted housing, typically generates minimal to no students. As a lot of the conversation talked about how the town seeks to, through maybe new commercial development, increasing the tax base. Property taxes are the primary local revenue stream for FY 2025. Southampton tax rate is $14.17 per $1,000 assessed value. Property assessed at $5 million, as an example, would generate $70,850 annually in property tax. Vehicle excise tax also contributes additional revenue. Assuming 1.5 vehicles per unit and average value estimated $300 per housing unit per year. So the National Association of Home Builders 2015 impact study, and this is based on 100 rental apartments. Year one impact, so this could happen anywhere, not necessarily Southampton. So I'm just using it as an example, where the town or the municipality received $11.7 million in local income from 100 rental apartments that all equated to $2.2 million in taxes and revenue. Annual ongoing impact, about $503,000 in local taxes and revenue. So that's those folks that live there that are contributing to your local tax base and revenues. Another conversation that we typically have is sometimes there are grant funding opportunities to fund things like infrastructure, especially if you have some private development, particularly the mixed use and the housing component. The One Stop for Growth is a funding mechanism that supports planning and infrastructure for housing and commercial development. The MassWorks Infrastructure Grant can fund infrastructure improvements to support private commercial development. And the Housing Works Grant is similar, but it's for private housing development. And an example of it being used locally was to support infrastructure improvements for mixed income housing in the mill reuse project in Easthampton on Ferry Street. Another component of the conversation is the Chapter 40R smart growth zoning. And so this is a one-time payment to the town for the zoning. If the zoning is changed, that allows additional housing units. And then there are ongoing per unit payments as housing is built, and then reimbursements for education costs from new students. And so I think that officially ends the presentation.
Thanks, everybody. We just have the diehards left here. We don't have a sort of formal plan for this discussion, but we just want to sort of reflect on a few of the things that we heard, give any of the members of the committees a chance to talk if you want to. Standing around the plan, I heard a lot. Most of it in the nature of, why are you doing this to us? And why do we need this? Again, our task, these are not finished plans saying, this is the plan for this site. Our task is to show you what the options are. And then based on that, we get an idea of how much could you build on here? How would the different uses fit together? And how much does that amount to just physically? And then that's a starting point for answering a lot of the questions which you raised very appropriately. And we respect your opinions, and absolutely you're right to ask those questions and to have an opinion about the site. So the decisions aren't made yet. But again, what we heard clearly is, who is this housing for and why do we need it? I think talking to people, that's what we've heard from the beginning, is there's a recognition that probably senior housing is something we need. There's a lot of people who are living in big single-family houses who don't need that space, but they want to stay in Southampton. If you could build nice single-level apartments or townhouses for people like that are close to services, gardens, public space, bike trails, that's got to be a good thing, right? So then the question is, who pays for it and what are the impacts on our taxes? So it's sort of two separate questions. One is, what do we want? What do we need? And then how do we arrange it on the site, which is kind of what we've been focusing on. And then there's a question of who pays for it and what's the impacts. So I think there's a lot of, I don't know, disagreement, but obviously we don't know enough maybe to say how much family housing do we need. My observation after 40 years living in the Valley is that housing has gotten to the point where our children can't afford to buy a house here anymore. Whereas I could 30, 40 years ago. And even 10 or 20 years ago, Dylan could buy a house. And like some of our younger staff are like the last ones buying a house because the prices are going up so fast that's getting out of reach. So what does that mean? We need to look at alternative forms of housing that maybe we're not used to. And that sort of brings up a problem in a town like Southampton, is the kind of apartments that you've had here before, not necessarily something that you really like to see because they're not very carefully designed, perhaps. They've been here a long time, they're kind of run down, and you're not used to seeing what I would consider sort of a modern family housing complex being built. So part of what we're doing with all these photographs is showing you what's possible. This doesn't have to be an ugly shoebox. It could be a beautiful farmhouse-style community with porches and gardens and places for people. Even though they're small units, you really feel like you're living in a real community, and it has a lot of the value that you have in your big single-family house. So we're just trying to show you what the possibilities are, and then there's that question of then who's going to live there, who's going to cost, who's going to pay for it, what are the tax implications, what are the school kid implications. So we're listening to that all loud and clear, and what we're going to be trying to do going forward is working with our committee and the other committees in the town is thinking about what is the outside range of possibilities, Do we want, what do we want to change in these two big scenarios? Is there one single scenario that maybe we can focus on? And then what kind of housing do we really want to focus on? What kind of commercial use do we really want to focus on? And then to answer all those questions which you've raised. Again, very appropriate to wonder. So I think my conclusion is, I hope we demonstrate this, we're listening to you loud and clear. None of the decisions have been made, but we're trying to get a sense of then what would actually benefit the town. If you set aside the question of fiscal impacts and tax impacts, what actually would be good to have in this location? What would be good for the town to have? I mean, obviously nobody can argue that you don't need a public safety complex. Nobody can argue that a beautiful senior center surrounded by open space wouldn't be a benefit to the town. Obviously it's all about the dollars and cents. So that's kind of where I'm at. Did you hear anything in particular?
I was at a quieter table, so I heard a lot less than you, but I heard a big range of opinions from people who said, yeah, this plan basically makes sense, and I think we should keep on moving forward, and we need a public safety complex, we need a senior center, and housing makes sense, and open space makes sense, and we want a connection to Greenway. So I heard people who said that. On the other side, I heard people who said, we should sell this site and get rid of it, and build the cheapest possible senior center somewhere else in town. So a broad range of opinions. I heard some specific things that were interesting, like that we didn't pay enough attention to the views from the senior center. And the senior center should be sort of in the back corner of the site on the opposite side from where it is, because there could be views to Mount Tom from there. Or that commercial space should open up onto open space instead of opening up onto parking in the back. So that would imply basically you'd have commercial space with parking beside it, but a better connection to the open space. I heard the idea of what happens to this site in the meantime. So all of these decisions are going to take a long time to make, probably. So what's happening with the site in the short term? Are there some cheap and reversible things that can happen to make the site beneficial to the residents of the town? Like basically put in a little dirt parking lot, have some walking paths around the outside, maybe establish community gardens there. Somebody had the idea of putting in a winter floodable ice rink. Goes in the winter, it comes out again, and so the site is basically useful in the short term, but ready for anything in the long term as the town makes its way through decision making. And then another thing that I heard that I think is important to continue to clarify is what's the process for making decisions and who decides, where are their votes. Heard a lot of questions about if there's commercial space or if there's housing, what's the process by which the town goes through to offload property to private entities, and how do you balance the requirements the town might want to put on that process versus providing enough flexibility so that things are feasible to happen. So how do you know what commercial entities might want to come in? How do you know how much they might be willing to pay? How do you know what kind of design restrictions the town might place on things that would ultimately not work for developers of commercial space? So again, there are lots of questions left to be answered. It's really just the beginning of the process. And we hope to continue to work with you to figure it out as best we can. Democracy is very complicated. My preferred metaphor for this is, if I want to go out to dinner by myself, I just pick a place and I go. If it's my wife and I, it's a little more complicated, but we can work it out. But if it's me and another, 3,000 people deciding where to go to dinner, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be challenging, and it's going to take a long time. And so you guys are, you're a community, and you're not just figuring out which restaurant you want to go to. You're trying to figure out a senior center, a public safety complex, how you remain a community that's open and accessible to lots of different types of people, how you connect to open spaces, how you wrestle with your sort of agricultural heritage, your rural character. It's complicated stuff. And we just hope that you all respect each other as you work through that, and that you come to the best decisions together.
First of all, I want to thank everyone who came out and was brave enough to share their perspectives. As Peter often says, it's better to know the bad news right up front and work with it as we continue to plan. I wanted to see if Scott or you or someone can remember the next steps in our work with Dodson Flinker, Pioneer Valley, that will bring this work back for a final look, I'm not sure when, and that will still just be input for the town to work with through its established boards and committees. So for those of you who felt your voice somehow got overlooked, come in and talk to the town clerk. There are open positions on nearly every board and committee. I don't know if that's true with the public safety or senior center, but there will be a land use committee. There is nascent now. Taking this forward to what I call a lot plan, so the town can say, yeah, whatever it looks like and however much it costs, we've got a parcel for public safety. And we ought to do the same thing for the senior center, so that we know we're not foreclosing opportunities, making this commitment or that commitment. We need all of these considerations brought in. All of the considerations that you've so passionately brought to us today. They have to get folded in. And in particular, a lot of what you're asking for is the next step after we come up with our best representation of how these uses could interplay and benefit. So, is there a date or a time frame? We're talking September? Sounds good. So, we're going to really work on what we've heard and bring back what is a final report analysis, which does not bind us into X number of square feet of public safety or senior center or even housing, yes or no, right? There'd be an area that is potentially useful for housing, but that will be a whole another bit of community input, design standards, unit complex, and selecting a developer through an RFP process. That's important work that is not being decided in some dark room. It's not now. It can't happen until we figure out the jigsaw puzzles. And so, patience. You know how to reach your public servants. We're all on the website. And come back in September and see where we've gotten with it. We need your input now and going forward. Final words? Other than thank you.
To anybody who was at the tables from housing or senior center or open space and greenway, anything we missed that you want to share? Nope? All right. So with that, I want to say thank you for coming. We appreciate your input. We do honestly listen to it and try to incorporate it and try to balance the various interests in the town. So thanks for coming, and have a lovely rainy Saturday.